You've been hearing a lot about Latin America now for some time. And in the midst of all the information that you... just not how did I do that? I just knocked it off? How did I do that?
You can erase the first part of the tape, I hope.
No? All right. As I started to say, you've been hearing a lot about Latin American studies and Latin America. But I don't know if you've had any time to think about how we think about what we're thinking about. What we call meta-thinking, right? Because after all, most people who talk about Latin America studied Latin America, and there was I can't seem to keep it on. Maybe I should put... No, my lapel doesn't open. It's just not working because it's not working. Maybe you can clip it someplace.
There would be out of harm's way.
Let me take off my jacket. Maybe that'll make it easier. Just clip it to the hairs of my chest.
No, thank you.
Especially when they're nearsighted and they've lost their glasses and can't see what they're doing. This is really a comedy. So the question of how we think of the things that we think is important, especially since, after all, Latin America was colonized. And it was colonized by people who shared certain ideas about the world based on their experience. And they built up philosophical considerations of the world as they knew it, or thought they knew it, or imagined it. And almost everybody in Latin America came to be influenced in varying degrees by those ideas, even if they had different worldviews and different ideas, cosmologies and so on, to begin with. You've probably heard some of the way that the early discoverers and conquerors saw the indigenous world around them, and how they conceived of that world in relation to perhaps their experiences in Europe or their struggles with the Arab world, which was one of their major concerns, or the Turkish world, or whatever in the history of Spain, for example. what ideas they may have imported from their limited experiences with those other worlds and with, say, Africa. And we have to assume that, obviously, given the power of religion as part of the apparatus of conquest and colonization, that those ideas became internalized so that even the indigenous peoples of Latin America began to reflect those ideas, not always fully. It was always a matter of the way their own cosmologies, if you will, and worldviews met up and hooked up with those of Spain and eventually Portugal. But obviously, and there's a question of power relations in that. One would assume that there was more influence stemming from those in power than those who were not in power, although one cannot always be sure of that, right? There were always, of course, differences among the colonizers, too. They might have all had, say, a broadly Christian worldview on the one hand and a military worldview on the other, given the situation of Spain and its effort to consolidate its own nation state, its counter-reformation, which I think you've heard about in the discussion of the Baroque, and the need to impose their sense of order on this world. But all of these, the processes by which Latin Americans, or the indigenous peoples of the Americas, those who survived the diseases, those who survived the wars, and the patterns of labor exploitation that you've also heard described, how these people became Latin Americans, and what it meant to be Latin America with all its diversity in different parts of this area we're calling Latin America, as if it were one thing, when of course it's many things, and yet it has certain kinds of unity, right, too, so there's that question there. How they became Latin Americans, what they thought about their own world, to what degree was that itself an accurate reflection of what that world was, given the influences and the worldviews, etc., ideologies as we call them, involved in all of these things. To this day, that even now, there are many people who, say in this country, who are Latin Americanish, who really doubt anything that any Latin American intellectual has to say to them about their own world, because, they have class and cultural interests. They're the criollo ruling class. They're the dominant class. Their visions, they don't see racism as we would see it. They don't see the questions of the indigenous populations as we, with our objective training in the social sciences, are able to do, and so on. So there's a question whether that enormous legacy of Latin American knowledge is really knowledge, whether it is, or whether it's a series of ideological self-justifying ploys. And then, of course, there's the possibility, as Latin Americanists say, Latin Americanists as opposed to North American Latin Americanists, or Latin Americanists who are institutionalized in Latin America rather than in the United States or elsewhere in the Western world, certainly, questioning whether the frames of knowledge used to think Latin America, so influenced by the current trends of Western thought, are at all adequate to understanding Latin America. So this is a question which we might call a post-colonial question. And certainly one of the areas which has developed in studying Latin America in recent years is the question of post-colonial thought. In addition, and I can go into that a little bit, in addition, there is the thought that there needs to be a way of accessing what we call subaltern knowledge. So the question of subaltern, what is subalternity, or what is this subaltern knowledge? It is the knowledge of those who in the articulated system of knowledge have no place. They are the slaves, the descendants of the slaves, those who have been in marginal positions in these societies, those who speak not through the canons of intellectual knowledge as established by the Jesuits or whoever in Latin America or outside of Latin America, those who speak a language which may be Spanish on the one hand, it may be Spanish, but it also may be a Spanish profoundly inflected by an indigenous language that is buried underneath the Spanish but is still somehow speaking through the Spanish? How do we, who have our frames of knowledge, ever have access to what they say? As one thinker from India put it, can the subaltern speak? Can those who are voiceless articulate their positions in a world where the systems of discourse are dominated by those who are not subaltern? And if they cannot speak, how can we access what they have to say? Is there any way to know about Latin Americans subjectively? I'm not talking about their economy, the politics, the systems which have been imposed or which have developed through the history of Latin America, but they themselves. So I had a list of things that I was going to put there for you to see. I don't know if you're going to access it here, but I will try again, as I try to do it each time, which has to do with how to think Latin America. And I guess you're not seeing this on your screen. But I'll give you one case. A lot of us who in this country became Latin Americanists in the 60s and 70s did so because we were caught up in student movements, civil rights movements. We suddenly veered toward interest in Latin America for one set of reasons or another. And many of us began to think that the way to understand Latin America was to read those who were trying to change Latin America, to read the writings of the revolutionaries. So maybe my first readings about Latin America were not 100 Years of Solitude, as you might think, because I was a person embedded in literature, and we might read that famous novel, or another famous novel, or a short story by Borges or something. But I also found myself reading The Diary of Che Guevara, or some of Fidel Castro's early speeches. And I guess I was really convinced, as were probably many people of my generation, certainly to what we call the left of my generation, that these people were speaking for the oppressed of Latin America. They were speaking a subaltern truth. They had access to it. Now, Che Guevara, just to give one example, after leaving Cuba for reasons which have been debated many, many times, and after some experiences elsewhere, decided that he, with his notions of revolution, had to make revolution in another place in Latin America, that he was a revolutionary. And he went to Bolivia. And in Bolivia, he believed he had understood the situation and how he could incorporate himself into peasant indigenous society there and begin to foment, transform minds, get them really out from under the shadow of colonial thinking to realize that they could be subjects who could liberate themselves from their subalternity and make history and speak, was very shortly betrayed by those Indians who he was trying to save, betrayed in quotation marks, or at least some of them, to the local authorities in their connection with CIA operatives, and was assassinated in Bolivia. To me, this is perhaps one of the greatest turning points in my own thinking and the thinking of many other people I know about Latin America, because this great revolutionary, with his vision of change in Latin America, apparently didn't know one thing about the indigenous people he was attempting to transform, or the overall world of Bolivia into which he had entered. He went there with, I guess you might call them Latin American Creole, left Creole if you will, radical left Creole eyes, or perhaps you might say European eyes transformed by his experience in Latin America, but still the eyes of somebody seeing the people from the outside according to a given set of theories and conceptions which did not have all that much to do with what was happening there. The case of Guatemala, which you're going to be looking at next week, is remarkable in that sense, especially one writer who I might just indicate along this path. His name was Mario Payeras. He was a revolutionary in Guatemala, and it's very interesting to read his beautiful books, testimonial books about his experience in the guerrilla and his contact with indigenous peoples and so on in Guatemala. Each book that Mario Payeras wrote is an expose of the false thinking he had about the experience he narrates. Each book he has to face the fact that he doesn't know what he's talking about. And reality itself, as his book, The Days of the jungle speaks to him. The people in the highlands speak to him, and he doesn't really ever understand what they say, but he understands enough to know that what he was thinking they were thinking was wrong. And so it's a very interesting, and then he goes on to get out of dealing, the first effort to create guerrilla Che Guevarist kinds of bases, what we call focos, using this theory that was developed by a Frenchman about how to wage war in Latin America, known as the FOCO theory. The intellectual was Regis Debray. Then Payeras went on to say, no, we have to work with the indigenous people, but how does one work with the indigenous people, relate to them? So he wrote another book about that experience, another completely failed effort to relate to the indigenous populations. And of course, there's a fierce debate of what happened with the guerrilla movements in Guatemala. Did they, as some say, betray the indigenous people, giving them the idea that they could make changes that they couldn't make? Did they at all protect them from the military? Did they not incense the military in carrying out atrocities against the indigenous people? All these questions that are part of Guatemalan history go back to some fundamental questions which, in the last analysis, are not strictly epistemological questions. They have to do with life and death. The way we conceive of something, the way we execute a project or plan, whether that plan is guerrilla warfare, revolution, modernization, let's industrialize, let's do this, let's do that. Does it really take into account the people who are there, the circumstances in which they live, or is it based upon models that are brought to bear and that don't really have a core relationship to the reality they're attempting to change? My favorite person in this regard is a guy named Karl Marx. Marx has a whole series of writings that are fascinating for a Latin Americanist. One that, of course, is the Communist Manifesto, which I invite you to read if you have not read, because in the Communist Manifesto he gives us a vision of the expansion of the world, and he begins, the discovery of the Americas. This is one of his historical overview. Begins with the discovery of the Americas, the bringing of the extraction of resources from Latin America, the conquest of indigenous peoples, the slave trade. It's a very panoramic view of how these things transformed not only the Latin American space, but the entire world. Latin America becomes the means of his accessing a huge, large-scale transformation, which he calls the rise of capitalism, right? Leading to the Industrial Revolution. It's an interesting document in itself because it's not even a Marxist document in some way, because his later theory is a theory based upon modes of production, very strictly, economic systems and the way they develop, whereas here his interest seems to be more in the question of trade, and the development of trade routes and the development of trade as a force of transforming the world. And it's a very compelling narrative, and one of the great 19th century narratives of understanding how what we call the modern world, certainly the modern European world, developed and its relationship to other places. Unfortunately, Marx also was a reporter writing about the Mexican American upheaval of 1846, and he also wrote about colonial questions in India, and some of his writings there are rather disappointing to somebody who's looking for the great revolutionary thinker we find in other cases, because there he is very much the European modernists, seeing that it will be much better to get rid of what he said in the Indian case, quote, village, it's a translation of course, village idiocy. One of the great things, even though all the terrible things that British imperialism has done, that's wrong, but at least they're getting rid of village idiocy. Well, there's some serious issues involved there, such as the law against widow burning and other things that he doesn't mention but have become part of the polemics of recent years about the relationship between the West and the rest, as it's frequently put, or northern versus southern realities, as other people like to configure it. But in any event, Marx was completely caught up with the notion that we have to develop capitalism first. Therefore, anything that does to develop capitalism, as horrible as it is leading us closer to exposing the inner contradictions of the capitalist system, which will then transform it. But my favorite passage in Marx. And notice that the economic system is predominant, and even though Marx tried to revise that and say, no, well, there's all these interacting factors, and that's what I'm going to get to, still, in the last analysis, maybe this was more Engels than Marx in some instances, but there is that tendency of the accusation that Marxism is an economistic and reductionist theory of global change. But it's certainly one of the compelling stories, as is Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and other documents that Marx knew of and leaned upon to formulate his own. But one of the more interesting writings I think he has is in his notes. He has a huge book of notes written before he wrote the final version that we have of Das Kapital, in which he says, how to study a society, the same question I'm starting with. How to study something? Well, you need to take into consideration production, consumption, distribution of goods. You have to take into account demography. There's a whole theory in the 19th century, Malthusian theory, which was a predominant way of understanding crises in the world through overpopulation, supposed overpopulation, and so on. And then he says, chance, liberty. These are just notes, fragments. Well, how can you build a so-called science, a science of history, if one of the elements of that history is chance? Doesn't that determine all the determining elements? And freedom. If there's freedom in your system, how systemic can it be? How do you qualify freedom? Under what characteristics, etc., can you do that? He also brings in some little elements that were going to become very important, like raising the questions of culture. There's even a footnote to Engels' editing of the manifesto where he says, where the document says, all existing history of humanity is the history of class struggle. And Engels, after working on kinship systems and his work on American Indian population, he was going over the work of an anthropologist by the name of Lewis Morgan, writes, well, all modern societies, because in other societies, kinship would be very important. Now, that notion of kinship and its effect upon societies and their identities and so on would be, of course, the center of what would become another way of thinking the world that was very important certainly in the 60s, called structuralism. And then it became, we're even patterns of myth and all kinds of cultural patterns, the way we even organize our food systems and so on, is subject to these questions of kinship. And then, of course, we had in the 60s and 70s what we call the post-structuralist revolution, another body of thought, which certainly influenced those who had formerly been Marxists or who wanted to make their Marxism a little bit more sophisticated and so on, and really became something that eventually led certain people, at least, to leave Marxism behind as a way of explaining Latin America. Well, there was certainly a lot of basis for applying Marxism to Latin America because of the whole history of exploitation and so on involved. But to what degree could you call workers in Latin America members of the industrial proletariat? Or even, to be more expansive and dialectical, part of a world system in which there were workers of different categories who made up part of an international working class that in one way or another had to fight to overcome the patterns of colonization and domination that had been set out before. Could you develop a history of Latin America in function of class that would adequately account for what you might, on another level, as a student of Latin America, see as some of its most pressing realities? Certainly, the history of economic development that you just heard in the last lecture, and the history of the situation of workers is very much part of the history of Latin America. But the people who this history is taking place, this macro history is taking place on, are people who, in one way or another, have been affected by a whole series of cultural systems that such thinking in itself cannot adequately capture. One of the first people to come to that conclusion, who had come from a Marxist tradition in Latin America, was Jose Maria Mariátegui, a Peruvian who had gone to Italy during the 1920s. And Italy was in the midst of a foment that was going to lead, of course, it was actually before the 20s, that it was going to lead in the early 20s to the coming to power of Mussolini, and that involved the growth of the working class and the working class party, the founding of the Communist Party, which on the one hand spoke for the Italian workers, but on the other hand became more and more beholden to the powers that be in the Soviet Union, or the powers that were at that time. There was a figure in this group very much economistically oriented in his thinking by the name of Gramsci, Antonio Gramsci, who was sent to prison by Mussolini. And one of the things that bothered Gramsci is why, after World War I, we have this terrible economic and social crisis in Europe, and we have all the so-called, quote, objective conditions that would lead to social revolution, as Marx and even the theorists like Kautsky of the Second International, and even people like Lenin, who had just taken power in the Soviet Union, thought would be the right moment for revolutionary change in other parts of Europe. And why did these changes not take place? Why did a right-wing party, able to pick up on certain of the themes of the left, come to power? And he began to think there are certain characteristics here in Italy. Now, Gramsci had come from Sardinia, which was a fairly wealthy country in some ways, a space in some ways, but it had been colonized by the Romans and then the Italians. They did not quite see themselves as Italian. And Gramsci began to think of what he called the Southern question, the difference between those in the north and those in the south, between those who were part of the industrialized European world and those who had not been completely taken in by that, but who shared cultural traditions and patterns that made their transformation into the, quote, the subjects of a Marxist revolution, into modern proletarians, virtually impossible to think. When he developed his essay on the Southern question, Mariátegui took notice. And he said, this is a kind of thing. He did this after he had gone to prison, when he started writing questions that were much more geared to the question of culture, much more so than most Marxists at the time, and also much more so even than a lot of the people who are not Marxists. He began to think of culture in relation to economic, social, and political dimensions, and he began to develop a series of concepts to try and understand how people who are, and he probably is the one who brought the word subaltern into Marxist discourse. It's a category that Marx would have rejected because he's talking about the proletariat, the workers, not just those people who may not be technically workers, who do not own the means of production, who are part of the labor force, part of a factory world, which is the world Marx certainly knew. It was so hard for him to think of agricultural societies, pre-industrial societies. He really had difficulty with that, and so did most Marxists. Mariátegui began to think of these things in prison. Gramsci, and they began to affect Mariátegui and other thinkers in Latin America. Not so much very quickly, but I would say the seeds were there for the development of a different kind of Marxist thinking, much more culturalist than the kinds of Marxisms that predominated in the formation of, say, communist parties and socialist parties throughout Latin America. And this took place during the modernization phase, you might say, of Latin America after 1900. As Latin America begins to send their products into the world market, as, say, a good case is El Salvador, where the indigenous population becomes transformed virtually into a mestizo population just in the relationship to coffee production, to the degree that they lose a good share of a portion of their, say, indigenous consciousness, and see themselves perhaps as field workers as opposed to peasants who work the land, or indigenous people who work the land, but still, of course, and there's always the trick, maintain certain dimensions of that pre-capitalist, pre-proletarian thinking and so on, which becomes part of their identity, certainly into our own time. Anyway, I'm trying to say a lot fast here, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that this cultural question, which really goes back to thinking the whole history of Latin America and its different stages, and the transformations of the peoples of Latin America, was very strongly rooted in a theory which now placed cultural transformation as central to the understanding of so-called objective processes, which had not been true certainly in the early stages of Marxism. Now, you had some of the opposition to Marx, such as, say, Max Weber, who kind of stood Marxist theory on its head and said, no, it wasn't the development of capitalism that brought about Protestantism and the struggle against the Catholic Church, which was the Church of feudalism. No, it was the spirit of capitalism embodied in the Protestant ethic that did that. So it was the Protestantism that changed that changed the economic system, not vice versa. A common ploy that was going to be very strong in post-structuralist thought as well, where, for example, Foucault would say, what brings about modernity is the development of these institutions which begin to transform thought about economics and everything else. So you have these alternative ways of looking at reality, ones that are very different from Marxism, maybe have some connection with it, etc. But I think what you can say is that most of this thinking along a cultural line had existed in Latin America for many years, but it became crystallized in the West as something called cultural studies through a development which took place primarily in England after 1968, after the collapse of after the famous uprisings of 1968, and the gradual decline of what you might call the Marxist macro structure of thought as predominant among radical youth in the West. In England, after the Paris 68, and with the rise of the conservative government, the English were asking the same question that Gramsci had asked. Why? England was a place of very many famous Marxists, right? Hobsbawm and E.P. Thompson and Raymond Williams, and many others. Why, given the development of working class culture, and what is there about that working class culture in England? I think the Beatles, working class culture. Did we get a society ready to vote for Margaret Thatcher? You know, what circumstances would lead to that? And certainly traditional Marxism would not work. Gramsci might help because he was going to deal with how popular sectors would end up supporting things that might be contrary to their necessary interests. But obviously, we can't look at culture as some Marxists did, as a very elite question of how important is the music of Schoenberg or Webern to the development of working class consciousness, for example. One that's a good cocktail party question. How do we think of the development of culture in England? And even, although Raymond Williams did not go there, how does the fact that England was the center of an empire begin to affect or have its effect upon even those who are not conscious of that dimension as they think through their worldview and their lives? What's the importance of popular culture, music culture, way people dress, the new punk styles that were developing as we got into the 70s? And Raymond Williams and others in what became the School of Birmingham brought Gramsci in to try and raise these kinds of questions. And then into Birmingham came another figure by the name of Stuart Hall, who was born in Jamaica, who was therefore Caribbean and also gay, who then said, the things that we're talking about are important, but they must also be considered in relation to things like gender theory, questions of ethnic identity, the submersion of ethnic identities within other kinds of frames. So the British began to codify a body of knowledge which we call cultural studies. And that body of knowledge became something that a lot of people who were disappointed by the failures in Latin America in the 60s and 70s to forge revolution as they imagined it, and who have trouble understanding the rise of Peronismo, the rise of all the different kinds of right-wing movements which had developed, and as we get into the neoliberal period which was described before, how do we account for this? Now they had, as I said, the Foucault theory. They had a theory which said that you could make revolution not by going through these structural changes of traditional Marxism. They had even developed a body of theory, because the thing is, is Latin America capable of theorizing itself? Can Latin Americans free themselves sufficiently from their European and other models to adequately theorize their own world. And one intent was, that became very influential, dependency theory, which argued that it was related to Marxism, but it said that you had to look at Latin America's situation in the global economy to begin to understand how it is dependent primarily on the U.S., but also upon other nations, and that its own internal development has been totally subject to the patterns of economic control and so on, and therefore it can never fully develop itself because it's in a system which does not allow for its development, but except in a form of dependent development which is favorable to those who are receiving the benefits of the economic system, but not the people within the countries themselves. There are a lot of problems with such thinking, partially because you're not looking at the internal dimensions. You're starting to look at everything external. But it was certainly one of the contributions that Latin Americans made to world theory and fed into the development of another theoretical model that also was related to and distant from Marxism, which is called world systems theory, which is kind of a prelude to globalization theory in one sense or another. But what I'm trying to say by this is that even in dependencies theory and in world systems theory, the chief problem that many people studying these theories have found is the lack of the cultural dimension, the lack of an understanding of culture not as a mere reflection or impediment to economic development, but as, in fact, a fundamental factor in understanding all of the other... What? It's all young again? Is that what you said? Jesus. Okay. To come to then more recent thought about the history of Latin American culture and to understand Latin American culture, obviously contemporary thinkers have picked up a lot on the British model, and some of them went to Birmingham and studied at Birmingham to try and learn new instruments for their knowledge. But of course the Birmingham model does not take into account many questions of indigenous systems. It does take into some degree the question of the African diaspora. One of the major developments, I think, in the last years of the Birmingham School was the development of the notion of the transatlantic and the notion of the Atlantic diaspora, the diaspora from Africa, as a means of trying to compensate for a bracketing or a submersion of this kind of concern as a subtext of not great importance in understanding Latin America, something which is obviously, to my mind, fundamentally incorrect. For many years, Latin Americans had been developing their own way of approaching their knowledge, and there's a whole history of that as well. And I'll just mention a few names and just to say a few things. From the moment of the independence movement, you can see a concern with the notion of who are we as Latin Americans? Is there a separate identity that we have from those who came and conquered here? Is there a basis for thinking of a Latin American unity? Bolivar, one of the leaders, became sort of the inspirations of this kind of pan-American, Latin American thought, which certainly had a tremendous influence even in Central America, where they had the struggle over the union. There was a man from Honduras by the name of Francisco Morazan who made that part of his revolutionary struggle in Central America, only to lose out. But throughout the 1830s and 40s and 50s, people were beginning to try and theorize their world. One of the most famous theorizations was civilization and barbarity. That was a body of ideas developed in Argentina. By the end of the 19th century, and it involves ideas that today we would probably call racism, examples of racism, but they did imply that the struggle was between all these currents coming from Europe, which were civilization, of course, and these elements of barbarity that had to be obliterated peacefully, if possible, and not peacefully if necessary, which became part of the battle cry of some of the caudillos, these people who ran rampant in the 19th century, tried to control the fortunes of states and economic systems and governments and so on. And I would say that that coming to the beginning of the 20th century, you have several thinkers who become essential. One of them would be José Martí, who spoke of Nuestra America, our America, our mestizo Indian America, as opposed to that America which developed in North America, which he considered materialist and not the same kind of world and much more centered on the fate of the white population and the subordination of other groups than he saw in Latin America. That distinction that he makes is still current in a lot of Latin Americanist thinking. The other famous expression of this was by a man by the name of Rodó, R-O-D-O, in Uruguay, who wrote a book called Ariel. And in Ariel, he tried to lay out this notion. He used The Tempest by Shakespeare as his model and said, well, we are Ariel. We are the spirit in the colonial process. We are going to be the ones who will have this humanistic heritage that will separate us from the scientific, technical world. There was almost an apology for this kind of division of labor between those countries, the countries in the north which were moving ahead with technology and industry, and those in the south which were subject to their great spiritual values, and of course populations that were not easily adapting to forms of modernity in labor and in other practices. And then you have, of course, Mariátegui, who I've mentioned, who tried to bring a kind of Marxism which thought the indigenous question, took it seriously. But perhaps it's been romanticized a little bit too, because, as has Gramsci himself, because when you read the 7 essays of Mariátegui, I think one of the first things that strikes somebody coming from Marxist tradition is he says, the problem of the indigenous people is the problem of the land. Well, it's true. The relationship to the land is part of the cosmology of indigenous peoples and is tied to, in Central America, the question of corn, and other places, the other conceptions of agricultural production core to their identities. It is frequently linked up to questions of the sun and larger cosmologies centered upon the sun and so on. There is an element of truth to that, but to reduce the indigenous identity to the question of land is to reduce it to one of the primary characteristics of the production of labor. The drawing upon the land to produce crops and so on takes us back almost immediately into what eventually can become Marxist categories. So the question is, how far did he really drift from Marx? However, he did set up the notion. Of course, he was influential in causing at least some people to say, you have to be able to think these things. And this is not a question of indigenous peoples before, it's a question of today. And it affects every phase of Latin American history. And today we call them problems of coloniality. How is it that we think the world without being taken over by the patterns that were installed as predominant within the colonial period and that still shape the way people in Latin America look at their reality? And I only give you a quick example of coloniality. Coloniality is you ask somebody who's Mexican a question that they can't hear, and what do they say in return? Anybody know? Mande, right? What does mande mean? Pardon me? There's there's something in it like as you tell me. There's something like acceptance of it as a kind of command. It's not a question. It's transformed into a kind of command that you're responding to. And that is so essential to being Mexican. And then the struggle against that is so central to being Mexican that one would say, as Octavio Paz did and many others, have we been able to overcome our colonial heritage in Mexico? To what degree? And of course, that's just one of 1,000 different examples of coloniality. Attitude toward race and gender, where even people of color take on definitions that are predominantly formed by the elites of their world. Now, of course, understanding Latin American reality meant frequently understanding processes of what they called mestizaje, no? Creolization, the degree to which peoples coming to the Americas became of the Americas. The way, and mestizaje, the most famous example of this mixing of cultures is, of course, given to us with the Virgen de Guadalupe as this kind of figure who is both indigenous and Christian and who leads to a kind of supposed coming together of cultural identities. In the 20th century, in the wake of Mariátegui and the first wave of thinkers left thinkers say about Latin American reality, the term transculturation became a very big term. Transculturation was not simply a process of mixing. It meant a process by which even those, and you can see it in opposition to, say, the term acculturation. Acculturation meaning where you draw upon the dominant mode and you adapt to it. Transculturation is this complex process by which we might say master takes on characteristics of the slave and the slave takes on characteristics of the master. It is the way in which subalternity is established, but also in which subalternity begins to strike back, by which we know that in the Americas in general, those in power take on many of the customs of those they conquer, draw upon them, if only for entertainment, or if only for like music culture. There's a very famous Cuban song which goes, Castellano, que bueno baila usted. Castilian, how well you dance. Meaning, I suppose you could say, how well you're adapting to our Cuban, Afro-Caribbean identity, but it could also be interpreted as, well, I'll say this to you, but it really isn't true. It's a form of irony, which you might call another form of coloniality, the way you deal with the colonial power.
I had a quick question. For instance, I understand that in the 19th century and 20th century, regarding the realm of literature and art, South America, both artists and writers worked together in the arts and sort of took from one and the other.
Really, between painters and writers?
Writers. It was a sort of great community of writers and artists.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I don't think that's true.
Really?
In the 18th and 19th century. Well, in each country, they were trying to form groups, and a lot of times their point of contact might be Madrid or sometimes Paris. But in Latin America, writers were pretty isolated from each other. And they were not, I mean, my understanding of it is that. And it's really in exile that they got to know each other better. Yeah.
Well, in the earliest 20th century, it was my understanding that there was a lot of writers, especially in Brazil and Argentina, but primarily there was an interesting sort of literature that I read in dealing mostly with art, where it talks about Brazilian culture or Brazilian art, actually Brazilian art and writing sort of being a sort of cannibalist of Europe, in which they take in, they eat up those traditions and sort of create a new reality.
That was the theory put forth by the Andrade brothers, and Mario Andrade was the primary exponent of that, and it was part of what we call the vanguardia of Brazilian culture. The 20th century is very different, and the 20th century, so many of the writers we can think about went to Paris, knew the Surrealists, came back with new ways of thinking, and the Surrealists were very much influenced by so-called primitive thought, by Africanisms and so on. And so Asturias goes to Paris, and he comes back with his whole conception of Mayan reality that he never had the whole time he was living in Guatemala. It's after he goes to Paris. The same with Cardoso, the great poet from Guatemala of that period. And this is true throughout Latin America. Huidobro, the founder of vanguardismo, Latin American vanguardismo in poetry, did his work primarily in Paris, came back. And this was not exile necessarily. This is not the exile. Although exile could be because writers could not find community nor learn from others very easily in their own capital cities, unless those capital cities were very sophisticated. But even then, the writers tended to leave. They left Buenos Aires. They left Santiago. Darío went to Santiago. He went to Madrid. They had to go elsewhere. Otherwise, they would have been isolated and would not have been able to have had the cultural effect that they ended up having. And now, just to get into literature, and I know you've heard a talk on the Baroque, and that's important. But one of the questions that arises out of this kind of thinking, the kind of thing that's looking at the genealogy of thoughts about culture in Latin America, is a body of thought stemming primarily from a friend of mine, John Beverly, who's worked on the questions of subalternity, which has to do with whether literature itself is a force of domination in Latin America, or if it is part of the solution. How many progressive people were writers? But Beverly would argue that the whole system of writing itself was a colonial legacy, the writing that we know, that the indigenous people and the mestizos after them had to get into that system of writing to succeed at all, and therefore they became subjects to that system. They might have thought they were saying things progressive, but all they could do was be the, I guess, I don't know who it is you say when ventriloquists speak. It would be that they're still part of the system. They're still controlled by their master's voice in some way. And so he argues that it's virtually that literature is part of the enemy, which we must be liberated from in Latin America, including all of our wonderful art expressions and so on. And this made him a barbarian and made him the anathema to some of my other friends, who he called Arialistas, because they had this notion of Latin America because of its suffering and this and that the great the writers were the future legislators of humanity, and that they would map out the imaginative terrain where future revolutions would be fought. But he said this is all nonsense, romanticism, and you're just setting yourselves up as the experts on what's happening in Latin America, what's great, what's really revolutionary, when you don't know anything. And he uses as prime example, not the ones I've given you, but the Sandinistas themselves, who he devoted so much time to studying and showing that they were, their literature and their art was really part of this new world that was being created. And he then later decided, no, it really wasn't. It was really a repetition of the same old patterns of semi-elites trying to now become the new elites as they take power in Latin America. This disenchantment with the early romanticism about Latin America on the part of certain U.S. Latin Americanists is what has made so attractive to them the most contemporary dimensions of Latin American thinking, which have picked up on the Birmingham School and have abandoned these thoughts of mestizaje, creolization, cannibalism, transculturation, all these other earlier forms of thought, and have now opted for questions of hybridity, the influence of modernity on all the different peoples of Latin America, questioning indigenous identity. Does it really exist anymore? Can it be seen apart from other things in Latin America? It's led to very fierce debates, certainly in my field. And it's meant that a whole group of people who used to work on literature, like myself, spend less time on literature and more times in these endless debates about what is what and what is where, as we try and figure out what we're talking about when we think Latin America. And I just will write down a couple of names, very important names. Nestor Garcia Conclini, I'll put his first name last. I'll do the same. Martin Barbero, that's his last name. Can you see this? Can you see it on the screen? Yeah, okay. And one could go country to country and name outstanding in Argentina, Beatriz Sarlo, who actually did go to Birmingham and studied with Raymond Williams before Stuart Hall, the Jamaican, came in and began to change and shift the gears away from class analysis and strictly popular culture analysis to ethnic studies, gender studies, and so on. Nellie Richard in Chile. In this country, probably the most famous discussion of cultural studies would be George Udesi, and one could name several others. It's Walter Mignolo who's developed the most coherent combination of what you call post-colonial critique. Although I think, and I can say something, I'll say something further about post-colonial theory combined with world systems theory to trying to see Latin America in the world, in its relation to other parts of the world, and certainly other parts of the colonialized world that's seeking to decolonialize itself, even after the political decolonization, many, many years after political decolonization. Because the question here is to free oneself from these older models. Mignolo was just here in Houston some months ago. I didn't get a chance to see him, but he spoke at Rice to the English department, interestingly enough, was looking for alternative ways of seeing their world, and has been very much influenced by post-colonial thought. The problem is post-colonial thought, as subaltern studies, developed primarily in relation to India and other countries that had been under English or British dominion. And that poses a problem. These are not countries where the population that settled entered and became part of the core population of the developing countries. Okay, that's a major difference. Also, Latin American processes whereby the Europeans become part of Latin America begin in the 16th century and increase in the 17th and 18th and go through all kinds of changes that these other societies never went through. So it's never anywhere as simple and to use such modes of thought. And so I think there's certain limitations or certain questioning of the models again. How can we use the theories developed in India or Africa, etc., to read Latin American reality? Because even though they might be third world and southern and poor and this and that, underdeveloped, as some people would say, they still do not necessarily have the same historical, social, and other patterns. So these are the debates that occupy many people in our profession. How Latin America, with its many historical levels constantly interacting and living at the same time, how Latin America can be conceptualized remains one of the major problems we face. And even when you develop theories of hybridity, or others say, no, hybridity blends everything together, we should talk about heterogeneity, we should talk about the heterogeneous, and then think about how we can organize our thought around systems of heterogeneity so that we can sort of explore and relate them. That means that difference still exists. We're not all becoming postmoderns just because part of the world is postmodern, or just because there are postmodern influences in our society. We have not fully experienced modernity, and as Europeans know it, we probably never will. We have our own kind of modernity, and therefore postmodernity as a body of thought is quite questionable too in relation to our reality. All of these kinds of questions are the ones that I think certainly not everybody was involved with them who's, say, a member of the Latin American Studies Association, but people such as myself, coming from literary theory, meeting with people who work on subaltern history and so on and so forth. These are the kinds of questions that became central to our kind of configuration of thought in contemporary times. Where, since 9/11, this is leading is hard to say, because that is causing another shuffling of the deck, both in terms of priorities in the global economy, priorities in the political economy of the world. Bush just came back saying, yes, he is paying attention. He has all these new plans for Latin America, and we know what happened with his plans for the Middle East, so we can hope maybe he doesn't get a chance to fulfill too many of his plans for Latin America. We know that for the United States, for example, the major issues have to do with what? Immigration policy, drugs, and a few other things. Is Latin America really important economically to the United States? In the long run, yes. In the short run, I don't know. How important are some parts of Latin America in the global nature of things, and what will happen to them in these new situations? There, questions of global concern have to be tempered by concern with the local. What are people doing in their own areas to either counteract the forces, the global forces that seem to be determining their lives? Are they finding ways to recycle their traditions? That's why I put recycling up there. Forgot why I was there. Reciclaje. To recycle elements of their previous traditions, to make them live even as they go through the changes that are part of modern life. By what basis do we think these things? Do we think the future of Latin America? These are the kinds of questions that cultural studies people are at least asking, if not perhaps very successfully answering. And I guess I'll leave it for there to give you a few minutes before my microphone falls off again. I don't know how much we lost, but maybe you have a few questions before we close. I know it was a little jumbled talking about all that European theory and then but that's the best I could do in the hour. So that was it.
I just wanted to know a little bit more about the dependency theory.
Mm-hmm.
Does that basically hold that the Latin American economy is lagging behind because it is so dependent on the U.S. and other foreign economies?
Well, yeah, I mean, of course, U.S. predominance is a 20th century phenomenon. We're not even sure how far into the 21st century it will last. It was outlined in the Monroe Doctrine, but it wasn't really a fact in the 19th century, where British took over from Spain and so on. You've probably heard about this and studied this. The theory of dependency, and there's many different sub-theories, so I can't say I'm speaking for all dependency theorists, is that the nature of the Latin American world, and possibly other underdeveloped sectors of the world, is such that its development is distorted in function of the role that it plays in relation to the more powerful forces. Or, in fact, that it cannot develop. It suffers not just a situation of underdevelopment, it is a permanent situation necessary to the functioning of the larger system, which gets to people saying, your wealth is a product of my lack of wealth. Even your literary systems, which are so rich, are the basis of our slave labor, right? Walter Benjamin, a Jewish German thinker in the 20th century, said all works of art are works of barbarism, and that's what he meant by it. Every achievement of civilization is based upon somebody's horrendous tragedy in some part of the world, whether it's directly where you can see it, say in the proletariat in your own city, or maybe somebody way far away. So the notion of dependency and its cultural implications are very central to a lot of people, certainly on the left in Latin America, who have been very ferociously against neoliberal reforms and globalization and so on. But there's been a lot of criticism even from the left of these constructions, so
Can I just add about the answer that in addition to the idea that Latin America is dependent in certain ways, just to phrase what Mark just said slightly differently, dependency posits that just as, how do I want to say this, underdevelopment is part of development.
Mm-hmm.
They can theoretically be separated from each other, but in terms of a process of change and how they work in the world, one is necessary to the other.
So could the dependency theory be used in the other direction to say that the United States economy is dependent on underdeveloped nations?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Wealth depends on plunder, in essence, and it can't exist. The wealth comes from somewhere, because the notion of dependency does, in a sense, posit that there is not infinite and ultimately creatable wealth, if that makes sense.
Yes.
It comes from
It's a closed
somewhere.
system. Yeah.
It is a sort of closed system. It comes from somewhere, and if somebody else makes use of it, then they have to develop, for example, the systems of labor that we've talked about in great detail. It's actually quite a complex process, and each is necessary to and part of the other. You cannot have one without the other. And I think that's really the genius of the idea of dependency, is it really explains the inequality of the global world. The problem with it is that it is a mechanistic way in certain ways of understanding each side, but I think particularly for Latin America or other parts of the, for lack of a better term, non-Western world, it is in a certain sense a very negative way of seeing those parts of the world and cultures, and taken to an extreme, it could lead to the idea that they have not been, as Mark has been talking about, they haven't been culturally creative, when in fact they've been tremendously culturally creative, and not always and not only in response to forces from the West. Mm-hmm. And I think trying to understand the insight of dependency without taking it too far is one of the challenges that cultural studies theorists and others face in trying to explain the complex reality of a world in which there is transformative change, which has undoubtedly negative consequences and effects, but it doesn't dictate everything about what people do and who they are as people, or as individual people, or as groups.
I think you couldn't put it any better, so I won't try. One book that is a popular, semi-popular kind of treatment of this, and that influenced a whole generation of people, was Eduardo Galeano's Open Veins of America. You know, he was not a major theorist of dependency theory, but he's a good writer, and he was able to give a kind of accounting, historical accounting, based upon this notion, with all of its exaggerations and its reductionisms and its limitations, you know, in terms of thinking through the way people actually live their lives. The interest in NGOs today, the non-governmental organizations, stems from the notion that there's all kinds of social creativity out there that these macro theories fail to take into account.
I know this might sound a little extreme, but I'm taking a class with Dr. Horn on race and racism, and reading a lot of his books, it seems like he sort of points to what he calls white supremacy as a root problem in many things, including a lot of the wars that we've had in a lot of parts of the world. Is that, do you think that should be something that should be taken into account when you talk about South American trying and Latin American trying to decolonize itself? I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, it's certainly something to take into consideration, much more than we normally do, perhaps, when we talk about Latin America. I think today you heard Professor Kellogg mention that in the colonial period in Guatemala, those poor Spanish had a hell of a time negotiating their relationship with the indigenous people because there weren't enough of them to really overpower them. But the fact is that, of course, much of the 19th century independence movement was an effort by the Creoles, and they were idealized, but to free themselves from a Spain which was going through liberal reform and therefore had better policies from most of our humanistic points of view in relation to the indigenous people than did the people, the Creoles, in their own countries, because they wanted to. Oh my God, we lost it again? Yeah, I didn't even know we were still on, actually. I thought we had gotten off, so now I'm sitting down. Now, I don't know how I can't relate to this thing. It just never got connected to me, so I don't know. But in any event, after the independence, the policies that were applied toward the indigenous peoples were frequently much more cruel than they had been for several hundred years in the colonial period. And much of the reshaping of liberals, the liberals in Latin America, who, in fact, even the left poets, one of my favorite poets is Roque Dalton, writing about El Salvador and the history of El Salvador, portrays them as, you know, the forerunners of progressive ideas, but in fact, there was a reason why indigenous people supported the conservatives in many parts of Guatemala, for example, because their world was more protected by those who were trying to change their world. There was a reason why a lot of the indigenous people in Nicaragua weren't that happy with the Sandinistas. They had been ignored by the Somocistas, as the Sandinistas said, and they said, we were happy to be ignored. We want to live our own lives, etc. We want better water, we want this and that, but we don't want to be transformed into Ladino Nicaraguans. We're indigenous peoples. So there's this whole question and even though people in this country might be seen as mestizo, in their own worlds, they function as the racial dominant over other peoples and cultural dominant over other peoples in their territories. And so it's a serious question that you have to think racially in terms of Latin America, as you do probably any place, especially in the parts of the world where the question of race was a major factor in the division of labor and development.
I have a couple questions. First one has to do with Latin American theorists, some of whom you named, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about their ideas and also how some of them differ with each other.
I think that most of these theorists came to prominence after the dictatorships, which certainly swept the Southern Cone. A lot of them were dispersed from the Southern Cone to other parts of Latin America, where they began to diverge. Most of them were Marxists in their first formulations. They began to diverge from traditional Marxism. They became Gramscian, and then maybe, in other words, centered on culture, and then maybe even drifted from Gramsci, questioning certain of his core ideas about hegemony and subalternity and so on. Some of them did not return to their own countries, but stayed outside. Now, Martín Barbero is from Spain, but he's been in Colombia for 30 years. He came out during the Franco period and settled in Colombia and has been a major force there, especially because his primary focus has been the question of media, television, film, urban culture, and its transformation of much of the Latin American reality he knows. And as difficult as Colombia has been to live in for many years, when he had to leave Colombia and he went to Mexico for a couple of years, I think it was Garcia Conclini who helped him get a position, he really was not happy there. He wanted to go back to Colombia, and he's back in Colombia where he'll probably spend the rest of his life. He's going to be 70 now. And I say that Garcia Conclini, who went to Mexico from Argentina, these were the two major male patriarchs of a lot of this thinking. But the women are very important, and they represent, they have a cutting edge that the men don't really have. If you look at the work of Beatriz Sarlo, who was, you might say, one of a generation of very tough, brilliant, intellectual women in Argentina, and the one with the best sense of cultural critique, and she brought to her work a lot of influences, not only directly from the Birmingham School. Because most Latin American cultural studies people say, well, we didn't need Birmingham. We had our own development of cultural theory through Marxism, through post-Marxism, etc. We didn't need them. And they will point to the fact that one of the great theorists of their work is not usually listed in these lists like mine, and that is Ernesto Laclau, who, an Argentine, who started as a classic Marxist, even opposed to dependency theory on the basis of classic categories of Marxist production thought, and then began to rethink Gramsci and separate Gramscian ideas from Marxism in a way that nobody had dared to do before, and to raise the question, is he really talking about, when he's talking about these alliance politics and so on, is he really talking about classes, or is he talking about sectors, social sectors that are not specifically class? And so he strips Gramsci of the last of his specifically Marxist connections, and I think had a tremendous influence both on Birmingham and on the Latin Americans, including Garcia Conclini, Martín Barbero, and so on. Sarlo is an heir to that kind of tradition, and there's much less a question of class determinacy in her her thinking. She's much more interested in the effect of media upon the games, all the things of the most advanced dimensions of technology as they impact societies which in many respects are traditional. So the impact of the most extreme forms of modernity or post-modernity with older value systems is part of what she's very good at studying. Nellie Richard came from the left in Chile, and of course she was not part of the Communist Party in Chile nor the Socialist Party. She was not affiliated with any of the major groups that made the Allende years as radical as they were. She was sort of in a group that was more anarchistic, questioning some of the directions and the dogmatism of the left, and very much into the critique of artists and art groups. But she became strongly, she's French in background, became strongly influenced by Foucault, by Derrida, by all the mainstreams of post-structuralist thought as opposed to, say, cultural studies per se, and began to critique the projects of the left as well as the right and establish a kind of radical space dealing with questions of gender, much more radically, say, than Beatriz Sarlo and some of the others. So she has been the primary gender-focused cultural studies person, I would say, in Latin America. Hugo Achugar has been back and forth between Montevideo. He was in Venezuela. He was there when Rama was there. Angel Rama is the person who adopted the ideas of transculturation, which had been developed by the Cuban anthropologist Fernando Ortiz, and transformed them into something dealing with literature and urban culture and so on. Rama influenced Achugar in a whole series of people who were in exile in Venezuela at that time, as well as in a generation of Venezuelans, including Beatriz Stefan Gonzalez, who's teaching at Rice right now. And that's where I met her when I visited Caracas in 1976. I think I've mentioned that, the biggest disciple of, and there's many other people one could mention. One of the best cultural critics that we have is, I can't think of his name suddenly, Schwartz in Brazil. Can't think of his first name. Suddenly it's lost my... Santiago Silvano from Brazil. Luis Buarque from Brazil. These are three figures of great importance. A lot of them are tied to people who are not strictly cultural theorists, but who are interested in democratization processes and social movement processes. And that's where I think the action is really interesting. Not so much the cultural studies people themselves, but their interrelationship with people who are thinking about social movements on the one hand, and then also people who are thinking about immigration and transcultural process, transnational processes of immigration and so on. That's where I think a lot of interesting work has been going on. But certainly Mignolo has connected his own work with these theories that I've mentioned. His main ties in Latin America have been with Aníbal Quijano, who has developed the whole theory of coloniality in relation to Peruvian society. And then you have the influence also of Enrique Dussel, who deals with another thing that we didn't mention. I didn't mention in my talk, but somebody hopefully in the course will give some kind of discussion of liberation theology, which was another strand of important thought that, given the strength of Catholicism in Latin America, and the new moves of Catholicism in the face of the evangelical movements which have been sweeping Latin America in the last 30 years. Enrique Dussel is from Germany, living in Mexico, another figure who's had a tremendous influence in Latin America. And that's all we have time for. There's several others, and you can see them on my website at No. Thank you very much.